Okay. I'm going to need a cup of sorts. Man, everything's dusty. I don't recall if I sussed out whether that was flat or not. Hey Jasmine, how's it going? Let me move OBS over here. That'll make it easier to see. I've extended the invite to some others. We'll see who all decides to show up. I'm currently looking for my flat black paint. Cannot for the life of me recall. Ugh. Oh fuck. Okay, well, that has descended into the depths to make a mess of everything. Maybe turning off my lights was a bad idea. Alright, I get it. Streaming is never easy. Oh yeah. Alright. Crisis averted. I'll not be using that brush. Not yet. Probably be using this old busted up acrylic one. Synthetic one, rather. Old brushes like that are good for applying primer. I'm gonna take a gander that this cloudy black paint mixture here is probably Testor's flat black. Might be a little counterintuitive to apply a primer while mixing paint into it, but I do not have a black primer, and I don't imagine a black primer is anything more than a matte drying suspender with, okay, I think that is flat black, with a bit of black pigment in it. Might seem like a strange step, but priming is incredibly important. Need to dust that off. Priming is incredibly important for applying smooth coats of paint over it. It also makes any unwanted bumps and lumps and flaws in the modeling process show through, so you know where they needs be adjusted. So, on to the mixture, I suppose. I do not have any way of really knowing the ratios that I'm using here, but just going to go ahead and drop in a little. Oh, this is completely off camera. It's alright. Not super necessary. It's not like I have an exact recipe here. I'm just adding flat black paint to Stynylrez Gray Primer. And I have a big old batch of boys to do this with. So I will be skipping over painting my resin models for now. In total count, we have 5 of this little figure here. This is a bit of a mess. Let's dry off my stir stick on this. Cardboard box. Okay. That's going to prove problematic later, but that is a problem for future Eric, not me. I'm going to be painting this. This is a force-grown drone from the Parabellum Games Conquest First Blood Spires Faction Starter Box. It's a mouthful. Parabellum Games makes the game Conquest, which comes in 2 versions. It comes in Argument of the Last Kings, or Argument of Kings, and First Blood. Argument of Kings is a large-scale war game. First Blood is a smaller-scale war game, mostly referred to as a skirmish game. Similar rules, but very, very different starting costs. Okay. Healthy number of drops of our primer. Just going to mix that up real quick. Excuse me. Okay, that's not quite black. That is still very much gray. Hopefully at some point this step will no longer be necessary, as I'll just be able to buy a black primer. But for now, gray and matte black is what we've got to work with. the hazard of my desk, I am pouring this directly into the primer at this point. Alright, it's still not quite black, but it is a dark enough gray that I am not going to keep mixing that. And again with the messy stir stick, I'll just leave it there. Okay, well, hopefully with a black primer you are not applying it so thickly that you would lose the detail. And the details on these models are relatively molding heavy, so a lot of the detail is very pressed in or very popped out, so you're not really looking for very, fine detail to be picked out amongst there. And there are a couple processes that will help bring back the details where we might miss them out. The priming step is just the first step. Afterwards, you're going to apply base colors, but we'll get into that when we get there. I don't know how many figures I will cover tonight, but I do plan on priming all 5 of these boys now, and then we can move on to painting in other streams. So I will be mostly batch working here, and the paint jobs I'm going for here are not going to be anything extravagant or anything exquisite. It'll be very, very functional. We'll mostly be mirroring this paint job. This was the first one that I did, and I'd say that looks pretty good. I say that is an adequate job for a tabletop unit. I don't know how well the color balancing is going to look on stream because my screen is very heavily tinted by flux at the moment. But yes, we've got a red cloth where applicable, white bones where applicable, washed with a sepia tone, and then dry brushed over with white to bring back some of the dryness. Ooh. There's a message from Henry. Will there be a VOD? I guess so. That's a good question. Let me move this little tiny palette thing over here. So I use a variety of palettes. I have a simple ceramic tile. This is a wet palette, and this is a Testor's throwaway palette, which is good for just what I'm doing here. I think I'm also going to be grabbing a bigger brush. As this step is very fast and loose, there is no need to be extraordinarily clean with it. I just need to find a large brush of adequate size. I've got plenty of brushes. I think I'll be using this size 5 brush. Very cheap synthetic brushes, because I don't want to use any of my fancier ones. Though I think every brush I possess currently is synthetic. Not quite sure about this particular series. This one here is a little bit frayed, but it doesn't have the fishhook thing going on, which is very common with synthetic brushes. I also lost a piece of plastic that goes over that. Probably lost it to my cat, to be honest. But yeah. And I'll talk more about the paints I'm using when I get to actually using paints. But for now, we have Mucho. we have much and more primer to be applied. Also, I don't know if I'm listed under the right category. When I went live, the stream would only let me pick one thing. And it asked me for a game, which obviously I'm not playing. So, again, there's a problem for future me to handle, because right now it's time to paint. One of the benefits of batch painting is that once I am done with the necessary steps here, I can move on to another model, start applying it there, and by the time I've worked my way around, hopefully, all will be good in the world and I can move on to the next steps. That is, assuming I don't have to mix any more primer. That would throw a wrench into my plan here. With primer, the goal is generally one very smooth coat. It's probably one of the only steps in the painting process where that is an object goal. Generally speaking, acrylic paints go on best, especially with miniatures, into thin coats. There are some really pain in the ass places to reach that I did not even bother painting on the first one. But we are going to try. I'm going to make a conscious effort this time to not just skip over these particular tough to reach points. Mostly because I've bothered with most of the other things I've painted to do that, so just wouldn't seem right at this point. Even though, I will say, when you have many of a unit, or many units left of an army to paint, this kind of thing becomes much less appealing. That is what we're trying to avoid. We don't want paint or thinner getting rid of details like that. This is where the time-honored tradition of pigment pushing comes into play. Because now I want to be using my brush to drag down the bulk of the wet paint so that details aren't lost in the process. Usually not an issue with the primer that I use. Stynylrez primer is almost specifically made for airbrushing, so it tends to be very, very thin, while not sacrificing coverage all that much. Kind of a best of both worlds scenario there. I'm also going to be looking to correct some issues or some mistakes rather, that I made on the first force-grown drone that I painted. Beyond just the areas that I skipped over, there were areas that I just painted erroneously, not paying too much attention to the sculpt. I also went through a lot more effort this time in removing mold lines and the like, because after painting the first one, those became very, very apparent. Injection molding is hardly a perfect process. Oftentimes, you'll be able to find and pick out the areas where the molds met. Generally, if you're going to be spending a decent amount of time painting the model, it's not going to look that way if you leave out that step of removing mold lines. Because it'll always, always, always distract from the intended visuals. Mold lines were always something I despised while I was building Gundam model kits, because I didn't paint those, so there was no sanding, there was no priming to remove them. And generally, it's not something you'll see if you're not looking for it, but as the modeler, you are privy to those unfortunate details. Okay. We have officially reached pain in the ass area. These ribs here, the underside and the inside of this arm, and this thigh, the side of the calf here. Quite difficult to get with the brush. And finally the bottom of the loincloth. Whoops! The bottom of the loincloth. And there we go. Oh. And there we go. Oh, excuse me. One model primed, and as the primer starts to dry, you can see the detail is still there on the model. It still catches light, so there should be no major issues when painting it later and going over it with another coat. What the primer has achieved, though, is smoothly tying together the whole modeling process. So now there's no shine from glue, there's no difference in that texture, nothing like that. No artificial lighting where we don't want it. And the beauty of starting with a black primer over just the standard gray that these models come in is, or even just using a gray primer for that matter, is that the black primer provides a good starting point for shadows when we get to painting those in later. And even though pure natural black does not really exist in our world, just like pure white, it's nothing a couple glazes of another color cannot fix. I almost feel like I could use an even larger brush for this. But I feel like if I step into that territory, when will I know that I've gone too far? So I've got some pretty huge brushes. This is often a step relegated either to a rattle can or an airbrush, neither of which I possess. There are rattle cans of flat black primers. And obviously an airbrush will do what an airbrush will do. I'm very good at applying thin coats in broad areas. Not so good at detail work. But an airbrush is a tool. It's not a solution to all of your painting woes. Especially not at a scale this small. I believe the scale in question here is 32mm scale. At least that is the size of the bases. I don't know if that also applies to these miniatures. As these are fantasy creatures, I don't know if there is an aspect ratio that they are shrunken down to. Nor do I know if there's a name for it. There's a stubborn little spot in here. There we go. I feel like if I go with a bigger brush, I'm just going to end up missing a lot of the deeper recesses here. It is equally, if not more important, to get the black primer into those areas. So regarding texture, there are techniques that I implore when I get to the color stage to help imply the idea of texture. Very little that I could do at this step to really affect that, I feel. But yeah, texture is not something I've really messed around with much on most of the minis I've painted, but I did apply it to one of the last ones I did, which I kind of painted as a sort of progress report for myself, in a way. Whoa. Gnarly. What is that? Just like a old paintbrush hair in there or something. It's the kind of thing that could spell disaster for a paint job. Obviously not during this step where I'm just glooping paint all over the model, but that kind of thing were to happen with a metallic paint, I would probably cry. Openly, on cam. Then it'd be on the VODs, you could always go back to it. And as far as magnifying glasses go, there are, for this hobby in particular, without commenting too heavily on the predatory nature of people who market products for this hobby, the hobby of miniature painting and assembly, there are tools out there that exist for that kind of thing. I don't personally think they're too necessary because the companies that make these things are probably well aware of the average age of their clientele and how very quickly failing eyesight will come to people of that age. But I find that everything you're looking at here is just small enough to be a miniature, but large enough that it doesn't really require too much zooming in of that nature. There's definitely very little here that would need to be really focused in on. Even with the model that I painted with a much more detailed sculpt. I mean, obviously it's easy to say that this basic little troop model isn't going to be too heavily detailed. I mean, yes, that's kind of a given. He's a battlefield expendable. He's not something too much attention ought to be paid to. He's impressive because of numbers. He's not impressive because of the individual sculpt or the detail of the model. But that is also not a universal statement. There are some units intended to be treated as, basic infantry and stuff that can be pretty darn detailed. But yeah, most of the companies that make these games do a pretty good job of staving off unnecessary eye strain, because I do feel like at some point a lot of the companies realized, hey, we're not really grabbing the new young generation. The people who are playing our games are the old folks. People of around, 30 to 40 to 50 years old at this point. Mostly because when it comes to purchasing into this hobby, you can choose to, take out a mortgage on your house, or you could buy Warhammer minis. This shit is expensive, man. I mean, let's be real. Board games in general are expensive. Plastic is expensive. Hobbies that use plastic are expensive. Legos are expensive. Mega Bloks are expensive. Really, anything that uses plastic is pricey. And it's not like gaming, video gaming, is a much cheaper hobby. What with a $1,000 and up machine required for maximum visual fidelity on the latest and greatest, as that quickly becomes a necessity and not just a luxury. Compounded on the fact that we are in a major shipping crisis, I suppose. What with tradeways being locked and all that. For reference, the model that I'm talking about, with all of the ridiculous detail, is this guy. This is a Warhammer Space Marines Champion Series 3 Cloticus. He is a Death Guard Chaos Space Marine. He is an icon bearer. There are a lot of very small details in this miniature that were fairly difficult to get painted, but again, with the right approach to doing it, nothing that really required a magnifying glass or any kind of visual aid, as it were. And I think I did a pretty dang good job on him. I do not possess the photography devices to showcase it, unfortunately. Not as well as I would like to. I'm very proud of that model. Alright, we're moving up. We're moving up in size here. I'll be using a flat 6. We'll see. We'll see how well this covers in comparison. First and foremost, let's get them bristles wet. Now, let's see here. Oh, yeah, baby. Oh my god. That's like, what, a tenth of the time that it took me to paint the first shield? Alright, well, we have located the priming brush. It's prime time for this priming brush. Oh yeah, that's heaps better. That is heaps better. And yes, all hobbies are expensive, period. I just think the prices for Warhammer miniatures are a little exorbitant. And while this faction that I'm painting here doesn't belong to Games Workshop and they are not beholden to Warhammer in any way, shape, or form, not like they're a hell of a lot cheaper. That's not true. That's partially true. Conquest miniatures, I find, are actually pretty pretty decently costed, to be honest. And really, with Warhammer, it's hard to throw too much flack at Games Workshop for being ludicrously expensive when you are getting a lot of plastic in those boxes, you know? Sure, you might pay $120 or something like that for a boxed set. But what you're getting out of that boxed set is many, many, many options for your little toy soldiers. Oh, a moth happens. I swear, whether my door is closed or not, these fucking things find their way into my room. The proximity of lights to my face has an unfortunate downside of attracting a equal number of moths right to my grill. Not a fan. They can hang out on the ceiling if they want. They can cling to the walls where they won't bother me. Instead, they want to be all up in my shit. Alright, you know what? I think it's high time I skip painting this, the inside of the shield. I'm only 3 models in, and I've already started to give up on this step. Now, I'm unsure about the exact rules of this Conquest game, but I know for official tournament-regulated play for Warhammer, miniatures are required to be painted. There is a bare minimum of requirements out there known as tabletop standard, which seems to have varying degrees of meaning depending on who you ask. Personally, I think it's cool that there is a painting requirement, but that's also because I am in this hobby, I should say, solely for the painting. I care not for the games that any of these things are attached to. I care enough to the point that I will learn the lore of the factions and or characters and or units that interest me. But beyond that, as our friends across the pond would say, I can't be asked. Alright, let's give these bristles a little wetting. Got all that primer goo. Definitely do not envy the work of these synthetic brushes. I honestly don't know that a sable hair would be a wise investment for me. While an individual brush is probably not too big an investment. My sheer propensity for ruining brushes kind of deters me from looking into that as a viable means of investment, and I've achieved what I consider adequate results with these synthetic brushes. And really, an ironic question to ask while streaming, but who am I painting for if not myself? I'm happy with my results. I need not impress anyone else. I will say, having these miniatures has definitely changed my outlook on gaming as a hobby. Well, for many, 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 many years of my life, it being the turn of the century and all, video games were kind of the prevalent thing to be into as a kid. And while I was never allowed to play the ones that everybody else was into because of their M ratings, I've always adhered to video games as kind of my main hobby, my main inspiration for other things that I did. But I've never quite felt satisfaction playing games like the satisfaction I feel from seeing a painted miniature that I painted. Even being able to look at the painting that I've done thus far and assess it for all its flaws and, all of the things that I might have succeeded on in said paint job. What I end up with is, to me at least, a quite interesting and quite satisfying result. A physical collectible that reminds me of something that I have done. Now, I wouldn't really say that painting is productive, but I've also always been into some form of creative outlet. When I was younger, it was always drawing. I didn't care much for reading, so I didn't care much for writing, but I liked comics because I could look at the images. And eventually I decided I wanted to create those images. And even with drawing, I never really felt satisfaction in creating something on my own, because I grew up alongside substantially better illustrators than I. I had no distinct style of which to speak. I only drew things that I saw on television or things that interested me. Like Yu-Gi-Oh! Card art, trying to replicate Yu-Gi-Oh! Card art, trying to draw Pokemon. Dragon Ball Z was hugely popular and I was given many an art book, many a how to draw Dragon Ball Z book while growing up, because it was one of the few things on TV my parents were aware that I watched. Yeah. With games and with drawing, I never really felt satisfied with the things I was able to produce. And that lack of satisfaction led to a very keen lack of drive, which I tried to overcome the hard way by forcing myself into a position where I had to draw to make money. It was very, very, very much against my own personal belief of art being largely worthless. I still don't believe in charging for an artistic endeavor. I do not believe it should be up to me to decide what my art is worth. It is up to the viewer. It is up to the, the patron, as it were, to find the value in your art. I may have watered this down too much. This is no longer applying evenly. Yes, this is far too liquidy. At best, this will just stain everything and dry splotchy. So this will probably need another pass. To elaborate further on my sort of emotions on the matter of charging for art, I think there's many an individual out there who looks to profit from their craft before I think I might have just splashed myself. I think there's many an individual out there, many an enterprising young individual out there who is told that it is within best practice to charge for art and to not do anything for free and things of that sort. But for me, the passion of the craft should take precedence, and I can't think of an easier way to throw passion under the bus than to get logistics and cash money involved. So if you're passionate about your work, if you do what you do because you enjoy it, and it attracts an audience of people willing to pay, by all means. It doesn't take a degree in economics to know a bad deal when it's offered to you. If somebody's telling you, yeah, I'll give you $2 for something that very obviously costs you more than $2 to make, you have a rough deal on your hands. That is obviously not a pursuit worth following through on, because they clearly don't value what it is you're doing. In cases like that, it is often that they value more the idea of having something that somebody else does not. And it's perfectly fine to turn down that kind of thing. but I think artists who set prices for their own work, I think they've, I don't know, I feel like you've kind of lost the point of art as a medium. It's very, very philosophical and shit what I'm getting into here. Because yes, there's obviously a material cost associated with what you're doing, but I feel like, as with most things that you're passionate about, it should be a hobby first and a profession second. Now, obviously, there's also graphic design to contend with, which is a real profession, it's a real pursuit, it's a real thing that is sought after by companies of every ilk. By all means, at that point, you are creating art that is marketable. What they are doing, often what you are doing is you are selling something that somebody needs to invest in, and that investment needs a return. So you have to be pretty damn good at your job, and if you are good at your job, then your investment minimum can become higher because other companies are making more money off of having graphics created by you. But yeah, personally, and especially with where digital art is concerned, I find that with digital art there's an immediate investment of a tablet, maybe subscription to a program that, of your choice, or the one-time purchase of a program of your choice. There is the time spent learning it and all that, but I mean, with time spent learning, really, it's the same for any other artist. No artist comes out of the womb drawing perfectly. You still need time. You still need to learn. So learning how to use Photoshop versus learning how to draw on paper with pencil or charcoal or whatever it may be you use, colored pencils. I wouldn't really count the learning process as something that's taxable. Now I still have wet primer here, so I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to prime a second set of off-camera models who will also be needing a coat of paint in the future. Just cleaning off the primer. The priming step is not the most interesting, as no real paint is being applied. But we've got 4 of these goofy goobers in their wacky poses to cover up. These guys are these shield bearer guys are the bulk of the box. You get more of them than you do these flippant lads, but each of these were posed by me, trying to be as creative as I could with the parts that I was given. Some of them are hits, some of them are misses. Yeah, I will be priming these guys as well, and then I'll move on to painting the base layers for each of the force-grown drones. This is a Vanguard clone infiltrator. They come with many different layouts, or weapon loadouts, rather. I have chosen to give each of these a different one, so we have a sword and crossbow, double crossbows, crossbow and shield, and sword and shield. This guy's my favorite. We'll save the best for last. Yeah. It's a complicated matter, and I'm sure I stand mostly alone on it when it comes to the idea of making art. Not for free, but I just don't really like the idea of getting money mixed up in a hobby, is all. I find that especially on Twitch and also on YouTube and stuff like that, it's very easy for somebody to turn their video gaming hobby into what they believe to be a viable career path, and people who quit their jobs to do this and immediately invest in very expensive recording equipment, cameras, and webcams, and capture devices, and all that. I mean, to me it seems no better than gambling, to be quite honest. Now, obviously, I've got an audience of one, so what do I know about success on Twitch as a platform? But from what content I've digested, I don't find many of the content creators that I watch, at least, will disagree that Twitch is largely a combination of effort, like 20% effort, and about 80% luck. You gotta be in the right place at the right time on Twitch to take off. You could have 3 concurrent viewers until some much larger streamer finds you online one day and decides, hey, I'm going to end stream early because my dog just shat my carpet. And boom, you get rated. Now you have 250 viewers that never would have stopped by to begin with. Now your channel takes off. Now, that's not to discredit the efforts of some folk to, make the investment, do the setup, hop on, the hottest game of now or whatever. Gotta respect the hustle. There are streamers out there who do put that effort in. Okay. These guys are a little bit easier to prime than the first dudes were. A lot of the surfaces that need painting with these guys are relatively broad, flat, and out in the open. Now, what I find quite interesting about these fellas is that the forest-grown drone is largely comprised of a bony material. The bulk of that model will be in whatever color you choose for that material. my impression of the models, looking at the sculpt, is that these pants that they're wearing are not pants, but they're actually a bony material. The problem then is that it leads directly into bony material for their legs, and for their knees, and for their feet. Everything on them looks very much like a bony carapace. So where does the color separation come into effect? The cover art says that the things that they're wearing on their pants, on their legs here, are pants, and they paint them like pants. They paint them a completely separate color. Then the bones and the boots and the vambraces get. The boots get the bony color. The vambraces get the bony color. The top part of the shoulder plate here gets the bony color. Crossbows get the bony color. The head gets the bony color. So why the hell would the pants not get it? There is no motion in the pants. To me, they do not appear as flowing cloth. Okay. I believe that is full coverage. No, it most certainly is not. Get into those recesses. Okay. Now that should do it for him. 2 down. Ooh. I'm running low on primer and black paint again. I will say, I'm used to streaming with a video game or a video game and having music on in the background or just having the video game music playing. Streaming complete silence while painting is a very, very, very different experience. I can't turn on music because I have no way of splitting it from my desktop audio. So it would just end up coming through on stream and getting me DMCA'd, which really only mutes the VODs here on Twitch. But it would also very likely do the same thing when it auto-uploads to YouTube. And there's almost no point in watching what will probably be 2 hours of me painting in complete, utter silence. In complete, utter silence. Not that my commentary is adding much value to the process here, but let's be quite honest, we've reached the epitome of boredom. This is very much so a stream about watching paint dry. Ow. In goes more Steinelres. In goes more of this cheap, crappy black Testors flat paint. Oh. I'm running out of desk space to operate a mouse with here. Alright. Let's get this thoroughly mixed. Whoops. And in we go. Also, I need to apologize for the obvious watermark. I really couldn't find a better program to use for this than XSplit VCam. My other alternative was DroidCam, but when trying to set that up in OBS, it only seemed to want to capture a very narrow area that I would then have to stretch out very, very far, and it would just make everything wide and not be all that great. What the hell? There's a tiny critter on the paper towel. Not sure what it is or where he's going, but he better be careful because he's probably huffing paint fumes. Just like me. Okay. I think this lad is finished. Just sort of make a couple last passes, smoothing out the coat. And by this point, there is very little paint left on the brush, so at most I am sliding pigment around. I'm being a real dingus. I have a painting handle that I'm not using. That would make this whole process a lot easier. Completely forgot that I had this painting handle that I've used for literally every other bit of paint that I've applied to all of my other models. And some here on the inside of the knee that I missed. Let's get that groin, polish the boots. Yeah. I know the better option is give up on the phone webcam thing and just get a fucking webcam, because a decent one at this point cannot be more than like $60, but would that I had the $60 to spend. On that note, I didn't purchase a single one of these models. It is only fair to give credit to those who it is due to. These were all a gift from a friend of mine in California who works at a game store. They could acquire these things at a pretty nice discount. I'm not going to sit here and talk about how broke I am while painting about $100 worth of plastic. Warhammer is a very bad hobby for a broke person. You know, at least with gaming you'll have your alternatives. There are free-to-play games out there. There's Steam discounts and sales, and GOG has great sales. Warhammer? Forget about it. Mini war games in general are no bueno on a budget. Not when it costs as much as it does to start an army to play the games. And I mean, for the sake of just trying the game out, it's not ludicrously expensive. I think many of the matched boxes that Games Workshop puts out to celebrate new releases are in the $100 to $200 range. And that comes with some starter stuff for 2 different races. Of their latest series of releases, the 9th edition of Warhammer 40,000. I believe the first box that kicked things off was a Necron and Space Marine box called Indomitus. Okay. Alright, so short of my resin models, that is all of this box primed. I'm going to wiggle my flabby arm a bit. I'm cleaning my brush. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Once this brush was clean, time for a stretch. My ass might be fat, but it is also very sore. God, I love those memes so much. It's specifically referring to Duke Nukem reading shitty quotes from Twitter as performed by one Gianni Matrigano. Okay, that is a clean enough brush for now. This is an adequately ruined synthetic brush. I'll have to give it some brush cleaner later. But I'm going to mute. I'm going to clean up a little bit. I'm going to have a stretch. Be back in a minute. Alrighty. Now then. start with a lad here, a bit more interesting of a pose. My wet palette is looking a little dry. Just important that I hydrate, as it does. I'll let that soak water in for a little while. And yeah. So this is where I hit it directly from above with a coat of white. Yep. Ow. Shake up some white paint. Acrylic paint notoriously separates. God. I just realized the way the stream is set up, the the XSplit watermark is inverted for some reason. I have no idea why that is, but it is. Okay. So, for this step, I will be using a wide brush. I think I could go even bigger. Yes. I'll be using this gargantuan 5/8 brush for this. And I'm not going to be wetting the bristles because it is of utmost importance that I don't. So I'm going to take this white paint, I want to dab it onto the end of this here, and then I'm going to clean off as much of it as I can here. And so what will happen now, I might have to turn off my desktop light for this, is very light passes of the brush will deposit paint on upraised edges. And what I'm looking for is to hold the model basically completely vertically, because I want the source of light to be consistent when I do this. So if I start going over these parts here, you can see it immediately starts depositing pigment. I just want to go right down the model in straight vertical strokes. Okay, that wasn't straight vertical, but we call that impatience. And I want to hit as much of the model as possible doing this. This process has the wildly misleading name of dry brushing, because that is exactly what I'm doing. I'm using a dry brush to apply dry pigment. And as you can see, even without my light, my desk light on, we can see where the white on the model has caught. And we can, most importantly, we can see where it hasn't. Now, the work of this step will probably it will very likely disappear from the bulk of the model by the time I am finished. But the goal here was not, not to have an end result. What this step does is it accomplishes the job of sketching where lights and highlights and such will actually fall on the model. Now, I could use much more paint because in reality, with a brush this big, I should have been able to do the whole model without any issue, but there is issue. So, let me get my desk light back on. Drops some more of that white paint, and I'm using Vallejo Game Color Dead White. And just want to dab a little bit onto the ends of the bristles there, clean off the most of it. We don't want very much wet paint going on, otherwise we are actually just covering up everything we did with priming and all that. So we want vertical passes all over the model. And where it doesn't hit exactly, that's perfectly fine, as this is a very, very thin coat of white paint just going right over the top. Again, we're not obscuring any details. We're not losing anything. I may have been a bit heavy-handed in this section here. And to get to a acceptable, rather low effort finish on these models, I will be repeating this step again nearer the end. Yeah, it is preferable that by the time I am done doing this, the bulk of the paint has been removed from the bristles of the brush. And this step works so long as all of your strokes are always vertical to the model and not horizontal to it. And because we are emulating light coming from the highest point, this is adequately known as a zenithal highlight. Now, typically, this step is done with an airbrush or a rattle can, much like priming, and it's usually done in primer. But yeah, again, as I own neither and don't wish to spend hundreds of hours per model fine-tuning every highlight that I do to a infantry unit that I have to paint 6 of, this dry brushing step, I think, does an adequate job of what I wanted to do. I don't know if that's focusing. I think it focuses that layer. So yeah, see, it's very basic, very splotchy, but we can see where the deepest recesses of the model lie. And now any paint that goes over this white will obviously pop out brighter. Anything that falls into the black will end up drying darker. And it doesn't matter that I'm going to be using the same coat, so long as it's sufficiently thin enough, those colors will still shine through, and especially as it dries, the color of the underlying paint will show through as a highlight layer. So this is a step that I have done basically to highlight the or to sketch out where the highlights and the shadows and stuff will fall. And there are some places where it doesn't look amazing because I made passes with the brush that went, errant. So this was mostly vertical, and then I flicked up, and you can see it's caught on areas down here where it shouldn't be. This area is pretty aggressively painted in. But even still, these aren't necessarily flaws or sins, because these are things that'll show through in the end paint job and make this larger, broader area more visually interesting to look at. So while he dries, I will do another model in this method, and I think I will just do those two for this session. It is imperative to dry off as much paint as possible from the brush when you do this, because you want the white paint deep in the bristles to provide a sort of reservoir to pull from while you dry brush, but you don't want it to be so wet that it starts leaving very obvious streaks. So again, totally vertically. Well, there's another issue where the brush caught on the flat surface. Yeah, in any case, that area should be mostly highlighted. And for some models, I'd say maybe for like a bust or something like that, I could see a black primer with a white highlight like this just being the ending point. Albeit a rather lazy one. But it's also because this step, to me, doesn't take very much effort. And again, we're just trying to highlight those raised areas so that we know where light and shadows fall on this model. Now, a very cheap upgrade to doing this with a brush and inevitably ruining it, because that's going to happen. Makeup brushes, large makeup brushes, are very good for this because they have very soft bristles. They cover very large round areas. And, to no one's surprise, the sun is very round and casts very round light. Not square, flat light like this. And this kind of thing absolutely wreaks havoc on these brushes. But because makeup brushes are round and poofy, it is not so for them. They do not suffer the same damage to the bristles because the bristles are sort of rounded out. Yeah, this kind of step. Models, probably not the greatest thing you could do. Terrain, however, I mean, this is basically it. This is like the only step you need for it. If you get really aggressive with the dry pigment, you can really color, or you can really bring texture to bricks and things like that. And dry brushing helps create texture for different parts of the model. So as I hit this shield, for example, with more of the dry pigment, it'll collect more of a dusty appearance, which in turn, for a gigantic bone shield, makes it look like bone. And one of the major benefits of this step is that as you lose pigment to the edges, it starts to blend out into a more realistic shadow transition across the rest of the object. Deliberately not hitting the inside of the shield because there's almost no reasonable way that light would get there. So yeah, that should cover that. I've got quite a bit of that white still left. No. I will leave it be. I'm going to wash the big brush, or try to. I don't want that white super deeply stuck in and ground to that brush head. It is kind of a benefit when these wide brushes like that start to flay out at the ends, because it does kind of give you a larger area to dry brush with. Yeah, so I'll add that to the pile of brushes that need brush cleaner by the end of this all. Alright, now on to actual color. So that will be decreasing the size of my brush. Going in with this friendly little fella, roughly the size of Games Workshop's starter brush. I believe that is a size 2, size 3, close enough. And for this, I will actually be using the wet palette. Let's go ahead and shake these up. Now the first thing I want to do is I want to hit all the red areas on the model. That are going to be hard to reach, because the white with a coat or two will be easy enough to cover up any of my painting sins, but it'll be much easier if in the right now I put the red paint down first. To do that, I'm going to first grab a different brush. Grab the size 5 again. I'll just use that to grab some paint from this little paint pot, put it out onto my palette. This is Games Workshop's base paint, Mephiston Red. I should say Citadel's Mephiston Red. And this is still looking a little dry, so I think I'm going to add a little bit more Wawa. Try to clean off as much of the paint as possible. Oh Lord. Okay. Yeah. The wet palette needs to drink up just a bit more. I have not yet mastered the water ratio that I need here for setting this thing up, but even set up improperly, this thing does wonders. Acrylic paint is very much water-based, so it thins with water, and it can be blended with water. But it also dries out ludicrously fast. Okay, that's about the consistency I want. One of the many joys of painting in this hobby is learning, at least for me, thus far it's been the learning process. And that includes learning important things like techniques and things like that, but also learning when to be messy and when to be neat. So immediately with the red, you can see how the black and white that I applied primarily is already creating highlights and shadows where they ought to go. Those can use fine-tuning later on, of course, but that is, in my opinion, a pretty good start. And this is why I use very thin paint. This is part of the main reason the wet palette is such an invaluable tool for painting in this hobby with these steps. Because acrylic paint is water-based, and because it can be thinned with water, oftentimes for me, applying it directly to this wet palette, if it is sufficiently wet and pallety, it will do its job, and it will naturally darken and highlight the parts of the model that I need done so, because the paint will be thinned by the palette. So I want to be decently tidy around here, but not too much, because this loincloth here is red. Also, that was absolutely word soup that just came out of my mouth because I could not keep a consistent train of thought going through that thought. So let me rephrase that. Because the paint is water-based and it will thin with water, applying it directly to the wet palette naturally thins the paint, and that is generally enough thinning for me as is. I don't need to bother adding any additional water. I don't need to bother adding, I don't need to do any more fancy steps or anything like that. Just applying it to the wet palette is enough. So I can afford to be messy in these areas here, but I want to be careful around that waistband. I want to be careful around the boots here. Yeah, just applying this coat right here is generally enough to make the first steps of priming and sketching those highlights worth it. And for this kind of thing, the quality of paint and the brand of paint matters a lot. Brand mostly because of the quality, but what you want are sufficient paints that are going to thin sufficiently while still getting good coverage. You don't want your paint to be so ludicrously thin that it needs 13 coats just to show through as the color you were trying to get it to register as. But you also don't want it so thick that it covers up everything beneath it. It's the kind of thing that also comes down to the artist's hand. You can't be too aggressive in certain areas that you're painting. You have to be wary of where the paint will want to go. You need to be able to push it around. So I'm bringing more water into the mixture here because I feel like it's getting a little too thick. Just drawing from that center pool there. But as we drag it out, bring the brush to a point, and we can go back in. This area right here is one of the areas that I messed up on the first one that I painted. Just want to make sure that I get this right this time. I erroneously painted the entire back part here the same color when in reality there is a continuation of the shoulder plate that comes in around there. You're right up into that little crevice there. And yeah. Generally, I like this process of inside-out painting where you go for the harder-to-reach details first and then get to all the sloppy, bigger areas that don't need quite as fine a touch afterwards. And for me, that whole area is basically everywhere that I'll be applying the bone color to. Now, another thing I wanted to correct was making sure that I actually get paint in here on these arms, because on the first model that I painted, I absolutely did not do that. Even if it's just a little bit of pigment in there, just to show that I did in fact try and that I do in fact care. That arm, on the other hand, fuck it. That arm right in here is what we call too much effort. So, onto the spear. Okay, when painting a round object, you have to be very gingerly with the brush, because a brush with any kind of stiffness in its bristles, any at all, is going to want to straighten out. And when it does straighten out, because it inevitably will, it is going to flick paint and splatter it onto something that you don't want. And we especially don't want red on anywhere we will be painting white. Alright, we are almost done with the red. We just need his little top knot to draw from this pool of paint here. A little bit more water. And then we want to bring the brush to a point, twisting it and get off any of the excess paint. And on this model, this area up here is fairly vaguely defined. So that's definitely a spot that we can clean up later. What is important to me is just making sure I get all the way around that little top knot. Okay. And we're good. That's all of the red done over a base coat of black and white primer, and hopefully it shows. Let's see, can I find an angle to hold this thing at to show it off properly? I'll get used to doing this eventually, but yeah, we can see the very obvious gradations between the white highlights and the black undercoat, and yet that does, without a doubt, still register as red. So we are not very obviously seeing a red with a black underneath it. We are seeing what looks like red that was meticulously shaded. And none of that has been done here. So, while I've still got the red on my palette, and while my brush is still stained in red, I'll repeat the process on another model in a different pose. Go right back in with some water first. Mix that out. Choose a little bit more water in here. I want to bring in pigment into our pool of water to make sure we are getting a good, almost milk-like consistency, which we have right there. I'm going to bring the brush to a point, and in we go again. This might be a little too thick. Yes, very much too thick. And a little too much excess paint. We want just enough on the end of the brush. And mistakes at this stage, like this overly thick red that I have there, is not too bad. It could always be fixed later, and that's one of the beauties of doing this that I have found, is that mistakes, if you're willing to put in the effort, are always fixable. In the worst case scenario that you cannot use brushwork and knowledge to fix something, you can always strip it and try again. We'll say our boy here is looking a little bit more vibrant than the last one. And that is because of the consistency of the paint this time around. But in time, the paint will dry and it'll thin out. We'll very likely see over time the dark come back to the dark parts and the light stick to those light parts. And yeah, this might take me a little while to do, but honestly, these are probably the easiest steps that I can think of that you can follow sequentially, the way that I do them, to the T, for relatively quick and good looking miniatures. Now, I did say earlier that this is not necessarily the time to be neat, but I still find that the neater you are at any step, the more time you take in certain steps like this, the less time you'll have to take later. So this is an investment of my time and my patience and my focus. Because it pays itself out in time saved later on. Any time that I spend now doing the dang thing, the less time I have to spend fixing it later on. And for certain steps in the painting process, that could be a lot of time saved. Sometimes you gotta get real creative with the painting handle here. Or at least I do. On account of being born flawed and left-handed. That's the right-handed propaganda that I was programmed to spew. I've heard shit like that all my life. Oh, of course you're doing that wrong. You're a lefty. Eat my shorts, I say. Left-handed scissors suck. Just give me the right-handed ones and I'll get used to it. Of course that punk would be streaming. He would deliberately choose not to watch my stream and to stream himself, wouldn't he? Fuck it, Justin. All my homies hate a Justin. Oh, look who it is. Punk ass. It's a little too thick. That's a little too thin. Okay. That one's going to need more than one coat. It's actually really hard for me to tell if this was if this is being kept in focus on the camera. Let's see, I knocked over my little dude here. I need him as a point of reference now. Alright. I think that's all the red on this guy. Not really. A little bit more to get down here. All right, I forgot his little shoes. Okay, so what today has taught me is that Wednesday is not a good day for this. If I am going to come back to streaming with any form of consistency, I shouldn't do it on Wednesday, Monday, or Friday? Question mark. Because Justin is not the only streamer friend who streams on these days. Clean up. And alright, we're rocking. That's all the red done. And that is red on both of them done. And for a lazier painter than I, this could be a finished product as well. We could call these Sin City. Oh no! Oh, wow. That was incredibly lucky. He basically fell onto completely dry paint. Alright, let's not do that again. But yeah, that is our currently finished product with the red. Oh god, I hate this. Why is it mirrored? I don't understand. But, okay. Anyway. The red is done on both models. Ow. If I wanted to be lazier, I could call it done. At that step, there is another color to be applied, but I'm going to end the stream here. I've got cleanup to do, and I've got to hit the hay. Yeah. That is quite a few steps done. In the future, if I could find ways to expedite the priming and zenithal process, then I will probably start most other paint jobs before, or rather after I get there, but I will probably be leaving